Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time, where love defies the most rigid conventions of medieval society. This is a story that transcends eras, speaking directly to our hearts about dignity, hope, and the courage to love against all odds. Imagine a kingdom where power and lineage determine the fate of every soul, where a simple servant can touch the heart of a king, and where truth struggles against manipulation. This is the story of Serafina and Fernando, a love that was born in the shadows and blossomed under the light of justice. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave your city in the comments. I want to know where our story is reaching. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like. It helps me a lot to continue bringing these narratives to you. Kingdom of Valderia, year 1485. The stone towers of Valderia Palace cut through the grey sky like ancient blades, silent witnesses to centuries of reigns and conspiracies. The wind carried the scent of jasmine from the royal gardens, mixed with the metallic smell of approaching rain, creating an olfactory symphony that announced changes. King Fernando III rode through the golden gates, his imposing silhouette outlined against the laden clouds. At 35 years old, he carried on his shoulders not only the crown of Valderia, but also the weight of an early widowhood that had hardened his heart like iron forged in the fire of pain. His hands, calloused by sword and parchment, trembled slightly, not from cold but from the exhaustion of a soul that had forgotten how to smile. The echo of his steps through the marble gallery reverberated like ancestral heartbeats. It was then that he heard her, a voice soft as raw silk, humming a lullaby that his own mother used to sing. The sound guided him like a lighthouse in the emotional storm that was his existence. Through the half-open door of Princess Catalina's chambers, a scene made him stop as if struck by a golden ray. His 6-year-old daughter, small and fragile as a wounded bird, nestled in the arms of a young woman whose dark hair fell in silky waves over delicate shoulders. Serafina de Montalvo. He immediately recognized the daughter of the count executed for treason years ago. But in that moment, she was not the descendant of a traitor. She was pure tenderness materialized, her fine fingers caressing Catalina's golden hair with a maternal devotion that made the king's heart contract painfully. "Papa never has time for me," murmured the princess against the servant's simple linen dress, and each word was like a dagger to Fernando's chest. Serafina kissed the child's forehead with a gentleness that contrasted with the rusticity of her servant's garments. Her eyes, green as emeralds cut by pain, reflected a precocious wisdom, as if they had seen more suffering than a 24-year-old soul should bear. Fernando stepped back, disturbed by the revelation of his own failure as a father, and by the strange agitation that the presence of that woman awakened in his chest. Thunder rumbled outside, and he knew that the storm, both of the heavens and of his heart, had only just begun. How could a simple servant awaken such complex feelings in a king? And what secrets hid those green eyes that seemed to read his soul like an open book? Dawn came like a golden whisper, filtering through the colored windows of the throne room. Fernando had not slept. He had spent the night walking the corridors like a restless ghost, haunted by the image of his daughter in Serafina's arms. The echo of his footsteps on the cold marble resonated like the beats of a disturbed heart. When he summoned Serafina for a private audience, she arrived like an ethereal apparition. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the polished stone floor, and the simple raw linen dress contrasted with the golden opulence of the hall. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, revealing the elegant line of her neck, where one could see the delicate pulsation of her vein, betraying the nervousness she tried to hide. "Your Majesty," she murmured, bowing in a graceful reverence that seemed as natural as the movement of reeds in the wind. Fernando studied her in silence, noticing how the morning light caressed her face, revealing the fineness of her aristocratic features, undeniable heritage of her noble lineage. There was dignity in every gesture, a contained pride that not even the position of servant had managed to erase. "Serafina de Montalvo," he said, savoring each syllable of the name like one tasting aged wine. "Daughter of Rodrigo, the Count of Montalvo." She lifted her chin, and for an instant Fernando saw in her the reflection of her family's ancestral pride. "Yes, Your Majesty. I do not deny my lineage, nor am I ashamed of it." The raw sincerity of her response surprised him. It was common for children of traitors to bow in eternal penitence, begging forgiveness for sins they had not committed. But Serafina stood erect, like an impregnable tower. "Your father conspired against the crown," Fernando said, observing every micro-expression on her face. "My father was accused of conspiracy," she corrected gently, and there was a subtle but significant difference in her words. "I was only a child when he died. I cannot judge the veracity of the accusations, but I can say that the man who raised me was honorable and just." It was then that the doors burst open with a crash, and Beatriz de Castilla entered like a perfumed storm. A 30-year-old widowed princess, she possessed a calculated beauty, every movement studied to cause impact. Her dresses always embroidered with golden threads, her blonde hair always perfectly arranged, her jewels always chosen to reflect status and power. "My king," said Beatriz, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "forgive the intrusion, but I could not help but notice the unusual presence of this young woman in private audience." Serafina remained motionless, but Fernando perceived the slight stiffening of her shoulders. Beatriz circled around the servant like a feline studying its prey, her ice-blue eyes calculating every detail. "It is admirable," Beatriz continued, "how some people manage to ascend socially through convenient circumstances. A servant who cares for the princess with such dedication." The venom distilled in each word was almost palpable. Fernando felt an inexplicable irritation grow in his chest, as if some primitive instinct compelled him to protect Serafina from Beatriz's sharp claws. What dangerous games were beginning to unfold in the palace corridors? And why did Fernando feel that Serafina was simultaneously the key to his salvation and his possible perdition? The cathedral bells were ringing matins when Fernando made the decision that would shake the foundations of the court. He had spent 3 days secretly observing Serafina caring for Catalina, hiding behind embroidered tapestries and marble columns like a young man in love, not like a king. Every gesture of the young woman was a revelation. The infinite patience with which she taught Catalina to embroider, the softness with which she combed the princess's golden hair, the wisdom with which she told stories that made the child's eyes shine like stars. It was as if Serafina possessed a natural gift for awakening joy in a child who had lost her mother so early. The council hall was packed when Fernando made the announcement. The nobles of Valderia, in their sumptuous garments and calculated poses, looked like marble statues covered in brocades when he uttered the words that would change everything. "I appoint Serafina de Montalvo as official governess of Princess Catalina." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy as the air before a devastating storm. Faces paled, fists clenched, venomous whispers began to circulate like serpents among the columns. Lord Alfonso of Aragon was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling with contained indignation. "Your Majesty, with all due respect to the throne, the daughter of an executed traitor cannot—" "She can, and she will," Fernando interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "My decision is irrevocable." Beatrice remained silent, but her smile was that of a viper that had just located its prey. Her blue eyes shone with a dangerous light, like ice under the moon. Fernando knew he had just handed her a powerful weapon, but something stronger than reason compelled him to protect Serafina. In the days that followed, the palace seethed with malicious rumors. It was whispered through the corridors that the king was bewitched by the traitor's daughter, that she had used dark arts to seduce him, that the morality of the court was being corrupted by an unscrupulous adventuress. Serafina endured everything in dignified silence. Fernando watched her from afar, admiring the way she kept her head high even when the ladies of the court looked at her with contempt, how she continued caring for Catalina with the same tenderness, even when servants treated her with calculated coldness. It was during one of these secret observations that Fernando realized he was losing the battle against his own feelings. The way the afternoon light caressed Serafina's face while she read to Catalina, the soft music of her laughter when the princess made an innocent mischief, the unconscious gracefulness of her movements, everything conspired to awaken something he had sworn never to feel again. On a particularly stormy night, when lightning illuminated the chapel's stained glass like celestial fires, Fernando walked to his daughter's chambers. Through the half-open door, he saw Serafina humming a lullaby, Catalina already asleep in her arms. She raised her eyes and saw him, and for an eternal moment, their gazes met. There were no words to describe what passed between them in that instant. A mutual recognition, a silent confession, an unspoken promise. Fernando knew then that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return, but would he be capable of facing the consequences of loving where he should not? And what price would Serafina pay for awakening the dormant heart of a king? The crescent moon filtered its silver light through the blue velvet curtains, creating dancing patterns on the stone walls of the princess's chambers. The night air carried the perfume of jasmine from the royal garden, mixed with the soft aroma of beeswax from the candles that Serafina had just extinguished. Catalina slept deeply, her golden hair spread over the silk pillow like captured sunbeams. Serafina delicately adjusted the embroidered quilt over the child's small body, her movements fluid, like an ancestral dance. Each gesture revealed the maternal love that had blossomed in her heart. Fernando remained in the doorway, motionless as a marble statue, observing the scene that had become the most precious moment of his days. The most powerful king of Valderia, feared on battlefields, respected in diplomatic councils, was reduced to a vulnerable man before the tenderness of that woman. Serafina felt his presence before seeing him. It was as if an invisible connection linked them, a golden thread woven by the gods of destiny. She turned slowly, and her green eyes met his in the perfumed penumbra of the night. "Your Majesty," she murmured, but her voice was barely a hoarse whisper, charged with an emotion that neither dared to name. Fernando entered the chamber with silent steps, closing the door behind him carefully so as not to wake Catalina. The soft sound of the latch was like the sealing of a destiny that both sensed as inevitable. "She is sleeping so peacefully," he said, approaching the bed where his daughter rested. "I haven't seen her like this for a long time." "Children's sleep is sacred," Serafina responded, keeping her voice low. "It's when angels whisper golden dreams in their ears." There was poetry in her words, a sensitivity that touched something deep in Fernando's soul. She was only a few steps away from him now, so close that he could feel the delicate warmth emanating from her skin, the subtle perfume of rose water that seemed to be part of her essence. "Serafina," he murmured her name like a prayer, and she raised her eyes to him. It was then that time stopped. The outside world, with its intrigues, conventions, and hierarchies, simply ceased to exist. There were only the two of them, suspended in an eternal moment of mutual recognition. Fernando extended his hand and delicately touched her face, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her face, as if memorizing every detail. Serafina closed her eyes and leaned slightly against his palm, a gesture of surrender that made his heart beat like war drums. "I shouldn't," he began, but she silenced him by placing her fingers gently over his lips. "Neither should I," she whispered, "but there are things that transcend what we should or should not do." When he kissed her, it was as if two souls long lost had finally found each other. The kiss was soft as rose petals, deep as ancient oceans, desperate as a final prayer. His hands tangled in her silky hair while she clung to the fine fabric of his tunic as if he were her only anchor in a world that suddenly seemed to revolve around that forbidden moment. They separated slowly, breathless, foreheads touching in an intimacy that was deeper than the kiss itself. In each other's eyes, they saw reflected the same fear and the same inevitability. But outside the door, a shadow moved away silently. Beatriz de Castilla had witnessed everything, and on her lips formed a smile that promised nothing good. The seed of destruction had been planted, and she would personally ensure it bloomed. How could two hearts survive in a world that considered their love a blasphemy? And what storm would befall them when the secrets of the night were exposed to the cruel light of day? Beatriz de Castilla's chambers were a reflection of her personality. Opulent, calculated, and dangerous. Persian rugs covered the marble floor, tapestries embroidered with golden threads adorned the walls, and Venetian crystals captured and refracted candlelight into thousands of sparkling fragments. It was there, in that sanctuary of luxury and ambition, that she planned her most elaborate revenge. Seated before a polished silver mirror, Beatriz brushed her blonde hair with methodical movements, each stroke of the brush accompanied by a venomous thought. The reflection staring back at her was that of a woman still beautiful, but who felt time corroding the edges of her youth like slow and implacable acid. She had waited 3 years for Fernando to overcome his mourning for the dead queen. 3 long years weaving a web of influence, strategically positioning herself as the obvious choice for a second royal union. Her noble blood, her experience as a princess, her ability to give him more heirs, everything pointed to her as the perfect bride. And then that insignificant servant had appeared like a weed growing among cultivated roses, threatening to destroy years of careful planning. "Milady!" The voice of Esperanza, her most loyal lady-in-waiting, interrupted her dark thoughts. Beatriz did not turn around. "Send in Rodrigo." Rodrigo was not the dead count. He was his bastard son, a middle-aged man with scars on his face and a soul sold to the highest bidder. For years he had served Beatriz in missions that the official court preferred to ignore. "What do you wish, Doña Beatriz?" His voice was rough as stone being dragged. "I need Princess Catalina to disappear for a few hours," she said without preamble, still looking at herself in the mirror. "A staged kidnapping. No violence. The child must not be harmed. Just temporarily removed from the palace." Rodrigo frowned. "And what would be the purpose?" Beatriz finally turned around, and her blue eyes shone with a coldness that chilled the blood. "Serafina will be found with compromising evidence. A letter in her handwriting organizing the kidnapping, objects stolen from the royal treasury, and gold coins suggesting payment for treacherous services. And the witnesses? I already have 3 servants willing to swear they saw Serafina acting suspiciously, for an adequate sum, naturally." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "The king is blind with passion now, but when he believes she used Catalina to reach him, when he thinks the daughter he loves so much was just a pawn in an adventuress's game." Rodrigo nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow night, during the new moon, when the shadows are densest." Beatriz rose gracefully, her movements flowing like liquid silk. "Make sure everything is perfect, Rodrigo. The future of the kingdom, and my future as queen, depends on it." When she was alone, Beatriz walked to the window overlooking the royal gardens. Down below, under the golden light of torches, she could see Serafina walking with Catalina among the rose bushes. The child laughed at something the young woman had said, and even at that distance, Beatriz could feel the genuineness of the affection between them. For a microscopic moment, something that might have been remorse crossed her chest, but it was quickly smothered by the ambition that consumed her like voracious fire. She had sacrificed too much to retreat now. "Enjoy these last moments of happiness," she murmured to the window, her breath fogging the glass, "because tomorrow your fairy tale will come to an end." In the shadows of her heart, Beatriz knew she was about to destroy an innocent. But in the chess game of power, some pieces needed to be sacrificed to reach the king. What forces of darkness would move during the new moon? And would Serafina be strong enough to survive the storm approaching like a hungry beast? The new moon had plunged the kingdom of Valderia into almost absolute darkness. Only the stars offered their distant silver light, like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The palace slept in sepulchral silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through the stone towers and the distant echo of the night guard's footsteps. Serafina awoke with an inexplicable start, her heart beating like a war drum against her ribs. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the different quality of the silence, in the oppressive weight of the night air. It was as if the very stones of the palace whispered warnings in ancient tongues. She quickly dressed in her linen tunic and headed to Catalina's chambers, her bare feet making only the softest of sounds on the cold marble. The door was ajar, something that made her stop, for she always closed it completely before retiring. "Catalina," she called softly, pushing the door. The chamber was empty. The bed, with its silk sheets embroidered with golden threads, was disheveled, as if someone had been taken from it hastily. The curtains trembled in the night breeze entering through the open window, a window that Serafina was certain she had closed. Panic bloomed in her chest like a poisonous rose. Catalina had disappeared. Serafina ran through the corridors like a lost soul, checking every shadow, every alcove, every corner, where a frightened child might hide. It was then that she heard a muffled cry coming from the royal gardens. She descended the marble stairs leading to the courtyard, her loose hair flying behind her like a black banner. The torchlight created dancing shadows among the columns, transforming the familiar into sinister. It was in the rose garden that she found her. Catalina was sitting under a pergola covered with jasmine, sobbing softly, her golden hair disheveled, her white nightgown dirty with earth. "Catalina, thank the heavens!" Serafina ran to her, kneeling in the dew-wet grass and pulling the child into her arms. "What happened? How did you get here?" I don't remember," whimpered the princess, clinging to Serafina like a lifeline. "I was sleeping, and then I was here. I was scared, Serafina. So scared." Serafina stroked the child's hair, murmuring words of comfort, but part of her mind analyzed the situation with growing alarm. How had Catalina left her chambers without any guard noticing? How had she reached the gardens without the dogs raising an alarm? It was then that the torches lit simultaneously around the garden, revealing figures emerging from the shadows like malignant spectres. Royal guards, led by Captain Mendoza, surrounded them with grim expressions. "Serafina de Montalvo," the captain's voice cut through the night air like a sharp blade. "You are under arrest for kidnapping Princess Catalina and conspiracy against the crown." "Kidnapping?" The word left her lips like an incredulous whisper. "I found her here. She was lost and frightened." "Evidence has been discovered in your chambers," Mendoza continued implacably. "A letter in your handwriting detailing the plan, objects stolen from the royal treasury, and payment in gold coins for treacherous services." The world spun around Serafina. It was impossible. She would never harm Catalina, would never conspire against Fernando. But the guards' faces were inflexible, and in some eyes she could see a conviction that chilled her to the bone. "No," she murmured, hugging Catalina tighter. "This is a lie. Someone is framing me." It was then that she saw Beatriz emerge from the shadows like a queen of the night, her blue dresses flowing like dark water, a triumphant smile curving her red lips. In the widowed princess's eyes shone a cold satisfaction that revealed the entire truth. "How tragic," said Beatriz with false sadness, "to discover that we entrusted our most precious princess to a viper disguised as a lamb." Serafina then understood the magnitude of the trap that had closed around her. She had been manipulated with diabolic mastery, every movement calculated to destroy not only her life, but also the love that had blossomed between her and Fernando. When the guards forced her to stand, separating her from Catalina's arms despite the child's desperate protests, Serafina raised her chin with the ancestral dignity of her lineage. If she was to be destroyed, it would be with honor. But in her heart, a question echoed like a funeral bell. Would Fernando believe in her innocence, or had the poison of distrust already been poured into his soul? The judgment hall had been transformed into a theater of justice, where truth and lies danced a deadly waltz. Red carpets covered the stone floor, and banners with the royal coat of arms hung from the columns like silent witnesses. Light filtered through the stained glass created colored patterns that moved slowly across the walls, as if even the heavens were restless about what was about to happen. Fernando occupied the golden throne at the center of the raised platform, but he seemed smaller than usual, as if the weight of perceived betrayal had shrunk him. His hands gripped the throne's arms with enough force to whiten his knuckles, and his eyes, which days before had shone with love when looking at Serafina, were now hard as millstone. Serafina was brought in chains, the heavy iron shackles contrasting cruelly with the delicacy of her wrists. She had spent 3 days in the palace dungeons, and the experience had left marks. Her dress was dirty and torn, her hair disheveled, her skin pale as ancient ivory. But her posture remained erect, her dignity intact like a flame that not even the worst storms could extinguish. "Serafina de Montalvo," the herald's voice echoed through the hall. "You stand accused of kidnapping Princess Catalina, theft from the royal treasury, and conspiracy against His Majesty Fernando III. The evidence was presented one by one, like pieces of a diabolic puzzle. The letter in her handwriting, which she swore she had never written, detailed an elaborate plan to use Catalina as bargaining currency. The objects from the royal treasury found in her chambers gleamed under candlelight like silent accusations. The gold coins clinked when poured onto the scribe's table, their metallic sound echoing like funeral bells. "Witnesses!" the herald bellowed. One by one, 3 servants presented themselves. Serafina recognized their faces, but not the furtive looks that avoided meeting hers. Their voices trembled slightly, when they swore to having seen Serafina acting suspiciously, conversing with hooded strangers, hiding objects in her chambers. Each word was a stab to Fernando's heart. The man who had kissed those lips, who had seen genuine tenderness in her green eyes, now heard evidence of a betrayal so deep it made his soul bleed. But it was when they brought Catalina that the theatre reached its cruelest climax. The 6-year-old child entered the hall holding Beatrice's hand, her large, confused eyes sweeping the crowd until they found Serafina. For a moment, her face lit up with genuine joy. "Serafina!" She began to run toward her, but Beatrice held her firmly. "Catalina!" Beatrice's voice was sweet as poisoned honey. "Do you remember what we talked about the night you got lost?" Confusion clouded the child's eyes. I remember being afraid. And who was with you when the guards found you?" "Serafina was there," Catalina answered hesitantly. "But she was helping me. Or was she ensuring you would be found at just the right moment?" Beatrice leaned down to whisper in the girl's ear. "How did she know exactly where to look for you in the dark garden?" The seeds of doubt were planted with diabolic mastery. Catalina, confused and frightened by the seriousness of the adults around her, began to repeat fragments of what Beatrice had carefully rehearsed with her during the past days. Serafina watched everything with growing horror. She saw Catalina's innocence being corrupted, saw the child she loved as a daughter, being manipulated to become the instrument of her own destruction. "No!" she finally screamed, her voice echoing through the hall like the cry of a tortured soul. "Catalina, you know I would never hurt you. You know I love you." But the damage was done. Fernando, blind with pain and fury, saw only a woman who had used his daughter, who had corrupted a child's purity to achieve her own ambitious ends. When he rose from the throne, his voice was cold as northern wind. "Serafina de Montalvo, daughter of a traitor, yourself a traitor, for your crimes against the crown and against my daughter, I condemn you to death by hanging. The execution will be carried out at dawn in the main square, so that the entire kingdom may see the fate of those who betray royal trust." The hammer of justice struck the table with a final sound, definitive as a tombstone being placed over a grave. Serafina did not cry. She did not beg. She only looked into Fernando's eyes one last time, and in that look he saw something that would haunt him forever, absolute forgiveness mixed with a sadness so deep it seemed capable of breaking the very heart of the world. How could truth emerge from the depths of lies before it was too late? And what price would Fernando pay when he discovered he had condemned to death the only woman he had truly loved? Dawn was slow to come, as if even the sun hesitated to witness the injustice about to be consummated. Fernando had not slept. He had spent the entire night walking the palace corridors like a tormented ghost, the echoes of his steps mixing with the wind's moans among the stone towers. In a few hours, Serafina would be executed. The woman who had awakened his dead heart would be silenced forever, and with her would die Fernando's only chance of knowing genuine happiness again. But it was justice, he repeated to himself. It was the price of betrayal. It was when he passed by Catalina's chambers that he heard the muffled sobs. His daughter was awake, sitting on the bed with her knees drawn against her chest, crying as if her little heart were breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Catalina," he entered softly, kneeling beside the bed. "Why are you crying, my little one?" She raised her tear-swollen eyes, and in them Fernando saw a confusion that made him stop breathing. "Papa, I don't understand. Why is Serafina going to die? She never hurt me. She loves me." "Daughter, sometimes people we think we know," he began, but the words died in his throat when he saw the absolute sincerity in Catalina's eyes. "She didn't do those bad things," the child insisted, with the devastating clarity of innocence. "Lady Beatrice kept asking me strange questions, saying words I didn't understand. She said if I didn't speak the way she wanted, Serafina would be very sad." A mortal cold spread through Fernando's veins. "What questions, Catalina?" "About that night in the garden. But I don't remember anything, Papa. I was sleeping and then I was in the garden, afraid. Serafina found me and comforted me. She always comforts me when I'm afraid." The child's words echoed in Fernando's mind like alarm bells. Beatrice had manipulated the testimony. She had corrupted a child's innocence to destroy Serafina. With his heart beating like a war drum, Fernando ran to his chambers and summoned his most skilled investigators. I want you to examine every piece of evidence against Serafina again, every letter, every coin, every testimony, and do it before dawn. What they discovered in the following hours was a web of lies so elaborate it bordered on macabre artwork. The ink of the letter supposedly written by Serafina was still slightly wet when examined under magnification. Impossible if it had been written days before. The gold coins bore marks indicating they had been taken from Beatrice's coffer, not the royal treasury. And when properly pressured, 2 of the 3 servants confessed to being paid to lie. "Sir," murmured the chief investigator, his hands trembling slightly, "all the evidence was falsified. Lady de Montalvo is innocent." The revelation struck Fernando like lightning. He had been manipulated with diabolic mastery, led to condemn to death the woman he loved, based on carefully constructed lies. His own daughter had been used as a pawn in Beatrice's cruel game. The sun was rising on the horizon when Fernando understood the magnitude of his error. In the dungeons, Serafina awaited death with serene dignity, probably forgiving him even in the final hour. In the main square, the scaffold was already erected, and a crowd was beginning to gather to witness the execution. Without losing a single second, Fernando donned his simplest armor and mounted his swiftest horse. The animal galloped through the stone streets as if carrying the wind itself, hooves echoing against the walls like desperate heartbeats. The crowd parted at his passage, whispers of surprise running among the people like waves. Why was the king riding like a man possessed toward the execution? What urgency drove him with such ferocity? In the distance, Fernando could see the scaffold rising against the sky like an accusing finger pointed toward the heavens. The executioner was already in position, the rope swaying gently in the morning breeze like a hypnotic serpent. And there, walking toward death with her head held high and firm steps, was Serafina. Would Fernando arrive in time to save not only the life of the woman he loved, but also his own soul from the eternal damnation of remorse? The sound of the royal horse's hooves echoed through Valderia's cobblestone streets like war drums, cutting through the morning silence with desperate urgency. Fernando rode like a man possessed, his black cape billowing behind him like raven wings, his eyes fixed on the scaffold, rising in the main square, like a monument to injustice. The crowd, gathering to witness the execution, parted in human waves at his passage, surprised faces turning to contemplate the unusual spectacle of their king, riding as if fleeing from demons themselves. Confused murmurs ran among the people like fire spreading through dry straw. On the scaffold, Serafina stood erect like a marble statue, her hands bound behind her back with rough ropes that had marked her delicate skin. The white dress they had given her as a final shroud contrasted with her loose dark hair, creating an image of martyred purity that made some in the crowd silently question whether they were truly witnessing the execution of a guilty person. The executioner, an immense man with a black hood concealing his face, held the rope with hands that had already taken many lives. But even he seemed hesitant before the supernatural serenity of that young woman who awaited death without tears or pleas. "Serafina de Montalvo," the herald bellowed with a voice that echoed across the square like distant thunder, "condemned for treason against the crown. Do you have last words before meeting your fate?" Serafina raised her head, her green eyes sweeping the crowd until they found on the horizon the familiar silhouette of the palace towers where she had known both love and pain. When she spoke, her voice was clear as crystal, carrying across the morning air with unshakable dignity. "I die innocent of the crimes for which I am condemned," she said, and each word resonated in the hearts of those present like a stone thrown into still water. "But I forgive those who brought me to this end, for I know they were deceived by minds more cunning than theirs. May God protect Princess Catalina and grant her a life full of true love." It was then that the deafening sound of hooves intensified, and Fernando emerged in the square like an apocalyptic vision. His black horse foamed at the mouth, panting from the desperate race, but the king did not slow down. He leaped from the saddle before the animal came to a complete stop, running toward the scaffold with drawn sword. "Stop!" His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, charged with an authority that made even the executioner instinctively step back. "In the name of the crown, I order you to stop this execution immediately," the crowd whispered in growing confusion. What was this turn of events? Why was the very king who had condemned Serafina now running to save her? Fernando climbed the scaffold steps 2 at a time, his breathing heavy, not only from physical exertion, but from the crushing weight of guilt and relief. When his eyes met Serafina's, he saw in them not recrimination or bitterness, but a sadness so deep it almost made him weep. With trembling hands he himself cut the ropes that bound her, each fibre that broke releasing not only her wrists, but also part of the oppression that crushed his own heart. "Serafina," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion, "forgive me. I was a fool, blinded by the manipulation of others. You are innocent, completely innocent." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. "And how did you come to this discovery, Your Majesty?" "Truth has a way of emerging, even from the depths of the most elaborate lie," he replied, extending his hand to help her down from the scaffold. "Beatriz de Castilla was the architect of this entire farce. She forged evidence, corrupted witnesses, and even manipulated my innocent daughter to secure your condemnation." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Beatriz de Castilla, the respected widowed princess, a conspirator. The revelation shook the foundations of everything they thought they knew about court politics. "Where is she now?" asked Serafina, finally accepting Fernando's hand to descend the steps. "Being arrested as we speak," he replied. "Her crimes against you, against my daughter, against me and against the kingdom will be judged with the full severity of the law." When they stepped together onto the square's ground, something changed in the air around them. The crowd, which moments before had come to witness an execution, now witnessed something much rarer: true justice prevailing over lies, love triumphing over manipulation. But there was still an unanswered question hovering between them like morning mist. After so much pain and betrayal, would it be possible for 2 wounded hearts to find their way back to each other? The royal gardens had witnessed many secrets over the centuries, confessions whispered between forbidden lovers, conspiracies plotted under moonlight, tears shed by broken hearts. But that golden afternoon, they seemed to be the stage for something even rarer, the possibility of true redemption. Serafina walked slowly among the rose bushes, her fingers absently caressing the silky petals that exhaled sweet perfume in the warm air. She had been freed 3 days ago, but still carried the invisible marks of her ordeal. Not the physical scars, those would heal with time, but the deeper wounds left by the betrayal of trust. Fernando watched her from afar, hidden behind a marble column like a young lover who dares not approach his beloved. He had tried to speak with her several times since her release, but she always found excuses to drift away, maintaining a respectful but painful distance. It was Catalina who broke the impasse. The 6-year-old child ran through the garden like a golden bird freed from its cage, throwing herself into Serafina's arms with total abandon that made Fernando's heart contract with emotion. "Serafina! Serafina!" cried the princess, clinging to the young woman's raw linen dress, as if fearing she would disappear again. "Papa told me you almost went away forever. Please don't go. Please stay with me." Serafina knelt on the soft grass, enveloping the child in her arms, with the tenderness that had been missing from her own childhood. "Catalina, my sweet child, I would never abandon you by my own will." "Then why are you so sad?" asked the girl with the cruel perception of children. "Why don't you smile any more like before?" It was a simple question that carried the weight of complex truths. How to explain to a 6-year-old child that trust, once broken, is like a crystal vase? It can be repaired, but the cracks will always remain visible. Fernando could no longer bear to remain hidden. He emerged from behind the column, approaching slowly, like one approaching a wounded animal that might flee at any moment. "Catalina is right," he said softly. "You are different, more distant." Serafina rose gracefully, keeping Catalina between them like a protective shield. Her green eyes met his, and Fernando saw in them a coldness that had never been there before. Not hatred, but a caution that wounded him more deeply than any anger could. "Trust, Your Majesty," she said with measured voice, "is like virtue. Once lost, it is impossible to recover completely." "You hate me." It was not a question, but a painful statement. "No," she replied, and there was infinite sadness in her voice. "Hatred would be simpler. What I feel is disappointment. You believed so easily that I could use Catalina, that I could betray you after everything we shared. That shows me how little you truly knew me." Fernando felt each word like a stab. I was blind with pain. Beatrice manipulated not only the evidence, but also my deepest fears. Fear of trusting again, fear of loving again. And at the first real test of your trust, Serafina interrupted, you chose to believe the worst of me. Catalina looked from one to the other with large, confused eyes, feeling the tension between the two adults she loved most in the world. Finally, with the surprising wisdom of children, she spoke. "You're both being foolish. Serafina, you love my papa. I see it in your eyes when you think no one is looking. And papa, you love Serafina so much that you got sick when you thought you were going to lose her forever. Why can't you just forgive each other and be happy?" The silence that followed was charged with possibilities. Fernando extended his hand slowly, like one offering crumbs to a wild bird. "Serafina?" His voice was a hoarse whisper. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I broke something precious between us. But if you give me a second chance, not as your king but as the man who loves you desperately, I swear by all that is sacred that I will spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy of your trust." She studied his extended hand for a long moment. When she finally took it, it was as if the garden itself sighed with relief. "A second chance," she murmured. "But this time, it will be built on a more solid foundation. No more secrets, no more unspoken doubts. If we're going to try again, let it be with complete truth between us." And when he pulled her into his arms, with Catalina laughing and hugging both their legs, Fernando knew he had received a gift more precious than any royal treasure, the chance to love and be loved without reservation. But would the kingdom accept this unlikely union? And what challenges still awaited a king and a former servant who dared to defy society's most sacred conventions? The Cathedral of Santo Isidoro, with its Gothic vaults that seemed to touch the very heavens, had never witnessed a wedding as extraordinary as the one about to take place. Millennial stained glass filtered the golden morning light into colored fragments that danced over the marble altar, creating a luminous mosaic that seemed to bless the union that would forever challenge the conventions of medieval society. Serafina remained in the palace's bridal chambers, contemplating herself in the Venetian mirror that reflected a transformation going far beyond physical appearance. The wedding dress had been crafted by the kingdom's finest artisans, ivory silk embroidered with silver threads that captured light like spiderwebs covered in dew, long sleeves that tapered delicately at the wrists, and a train that spread around her like white rose petals. But it was in her eyes that the true transformation was revealed. The woman looking back from the mirror was no longer the humiliated servant or the condemned prisoner. She was a queen in formation, someone who had crossed through the fire of adversity and emerged stronger, wiser, more beautiful in her conquered dignity. "Are you ready, my dear?" The soft voice came from the door, where Mother Esperanza waited, the abbess who had cared for Serafina during the final preparations. "As ready as someone can be to change the course of history," Serafina replied, with a smile that mixed nervousness and determination. Outside, the kingdom of Valderia seethed with contradictory emotions. In the streets, crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. Some came driven by curiosity, others by genuine joy at seeing their king find happiness again. But there were also those who whispered in disapproval, shocked by the idea of a former servant, daughter of an executed traitor, becoming their queen. In the cathedral, the nobility settled into oak-carved benches, their sumptuous attire contrasting with carefully neutral expressions. Lord Alfonso of Aragon constantly adjusted his collar as if it were strangling him, while the Countess of Medina fanned herself vigorously despite the mild weather, as if the very idea of the ceremony made her sweat with discomfort. Fernando waited at the altar, magnificent in his ceremonial armor polished to shine like liquid silver. Over it, a purple mantle embroidered with the royal coat of arms flowed like a royal cascade. But it was in his face that one could read the true story, the transformation of a bitter man into someone who had rediscovered the capacity to love without reservation. Catalina, as maid of honor in a sky-blue silk dress, radiated a happiness that was contagious even to the most skeptical. She had insisted on carrying the rings on a velvet cushion embroidered by her own small fingers, and her smile was so radiant it seemed capable of illuminating the entire cathedral. When the cathedral's double doors opened with majestic solemnity, A reverent silence descended upon the congregation. Serafina appeared in the threshold like a vision from another world, the sunlight creating a natural halo around her figure. She walked down the central aisle with measured steps, each movement flowing like water over polished stones. There was no haste in her gestures, no attempt to diminish her own presence. She had learned that true nobility came not from birth, but from character forged in the furnaces of adversity. When she reached the altar and her eyes met Fernando's, the world around them simply ceased to exist. There stood two souls who had crossed terrible storms to reach that moment, two people who had learned that true love is not just feeling, but choice renewed each day. Archbishop Rodrigo, in his golden vestments and mitre, encrusted with precious stones, raised his hands to bless the union. His voice echoed through the cathedral's vaults like sacred thunder. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Fernando III, King of Valderia, and Serafina de Montalvo in holy matrimony. May this union be blessed by heaven and serve as an example that true love transcends all earthly barriers. When they exchanged vows, their words were whispered only for the two of them, intimate promises that rose to heaven like sacred incense. And when Fernando placed the queen's crown on Serafina's head, a delicate piece of goldsmithery encrusted with emeralds that perfectly matched her eyes, she became not only his wife, but also the Queen of Valderia. The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed not only by those present in the cathedral, but seemed to echo through the very heavens, a promise that sometimes, just sometimes, love manages to triumph over all adversities. But would this happiness last? What challenges awaited the new monarchs in a kingdom still divided about their unlikely union? 10 years had passed like pages from a golden book, each recording moments of a happiness that few dared believe possible when it all began. The kingdom of Valderia prospered under the joint reign of Fernando and Serafina, as if the very love between them had spread across the lands like divine blessing, fertilizing fields, strengthening alliances, and bringing peace to a people who had forgotten how to smile collectively. The palace, which once echoed with intrigues and malicious whispers, now reverberated with the sweetest sound possible, the laughter of children running through marble corridors. Prince Fernando IV, at 8 years old, possessed his mother's green eyes and his father's implacable determination, a combination that promised a bright future for the kingdom. Princess Isabel, 6 years old, had inherited her father's golden hair and her mother's natural grace, moving through the palace like a small golden ballerina. Serafina remained on the balcony of her private chambers, observing the royal gardens where everything had begun. At 34 years old, she had become a queen respected not only for her beauty, which time had merely refined, like wine that improves with age, but for her wisdom and compassion. She had established orphanages throughout the kingdom, schools for poor children, and a justice system that protected society's most vulnerable. Her hair, now held in an elaborate crown of rose gold encrusted with emeralds, captured the evening light like threads of black silk. The royal dress of emerald green velvet flowed around her like liquid water, but it was in her eyes that one could read the true story of her journey. There was a depth in them that spoke of suffering transformed into wisdom, of tears transformed into strength. "My contemplative queen," Fernando's familiar voice made her smile before even turning around. He approached from behind, wrapping her in his arms in a gesture that had become a sacred ritual of every afternoon. At 45 years old, Fernando had maintained his royal bearing, but now there was a softness in his features that hadn't existed before meeting Serafina. Love had polished the hardest edges of his personality, transforming him from a feared monarch into a beloved king. "Just remembering," she murmured, leaning back against his chest. "Do you remember when you found me in this same garden for the first time? How could I forget? You were singing to Catalina, and I knew in that moment that my life had changed forever, even without understanding how." Catalina, the girl who was now a 16-year-old young woman, a beloved princess who had grown up surrounded by the love of two parents who adored her. She would marry next year to Prince Eduardo of Castile, a union based not on political convenience, but on genuine love that had blossomed during a diplomatic visit. "And Beatrice?" Serafina asked softly without rancor in her voice. Fernando sighed, holding her closer to him. "She remains at the convent of Santa Clara. The nuns say she found some peace in prayers and penance. Sometimes I wonder if she wasn't as much a prisoner of her own ambitions as we were victims of her conspiracies. It was typical of Serafina to find compassion even for those who had tried to destroy her. It was one of the qualities that made her an extraordinary queen, the ability to transform hurt into mercy, wounds into wisdom. The French ambassadors arrived today. Fernando changed the subject, delicately kissing the curve of her neck. They want to discuss the trade treaty. And? It can wait until tomorrow. Tonight belongs only to us. As if summoned by his words, Fernando IV and Isabel appeared running through the garden, chasing golden butterflies among the rose bushes. Catalina followed them with the radiant smile of a young woman in love. She had received a letter from Eduardo that morning, and since then seemed to float instead of walk. Watching her children play in the same garden where she had faced her greatest fears and discovered her greatest love, Serafina felt a gratitude so deep it almost hurt. There were moments when she still awakened thinking it was all just a dream, that she was still a simple servant, that Fernando was nothing more than an impossible fantasy. But then she felt his arms around her, heard her children's laughter, saw the genuine respect in her subjects' eyes, and knew that sometimes fairy tales really do come true. "I love you," Fernando murmured in her ear, words he repeated every day like a sacred mantra. "And I love you," she replied, turning in his arms to look into his eyes. "Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows God grants us." When they kissed, it was with the passion of young lovers and the depth of souls who had faced storms together and emerged stronger. Around them, the kingdom of Valderia continued its prosperous existence, but for Fernando and Serafina, the entire world fit within that embrace. Their love had begun in shadows and blossomed under the light of truth. It had survived betrayal, distrust, social conventions, and the test of time, and it would continue to flourish, generation after generation, eternal proof that when two souls are destined for each other, not even the darkest powers in the world can separate them forever. On the horizon, the sun set like a golden blessing over the kingdom, promising another day of happiness for those who had dared to believe that true love always finds its way.